Section C, the challenge of resource management. We've got to answer 2 questions in this section. So everyone's got to answer question 3 and then we'll get a choice. Some schools will teach about food, which is question 4. We have taught about question 5, which is water, or some schools again have done energy. So 4 and 6 will be blank. We will do question 3 and question 5. So for question 3, study figure 9, a map showing world oil consumption or use in 2016. So we've got our map. This time we do have place names on. And the question is, what is the difference between Africa and North America's share of world oil consumption, shown in the figure? So we'll look at Africa. They've got 4 squares. Now each square represents 1% of world oil consumption. So Africa has 4%, North America has 24%. So you could say something like the difference is 20%, or you could say maybe that North America's consumption is 6 times as much as Africa. Point 2. Using figure 9 and your own understanding, suggest how inequalities in the consumption of resources influence well-being. Okay, first of all, we've got to reference figure 9, which was this map of the world here. So we've got numbers if we use the key for all of the squares, so how much oil is being used. We've got region names, continent names, so we'll have to use those. And the question is, suggest how inequalities, so basically how the fact that people consume different amounts of oil influences your well-being, or your quality of life. So we could, first of all, just identify the pattern. Who is using the most oil? Well, we've got North America, we've got Asia Pacific, they seem to be the biggest, and also Europe. So what do we know about these places? Well, we know these places, the vast majority at least, particularly North America and Europe, are HICs. Asia, slightly different, but a lot of developing countries. So the question is basically getting you to think about, well, why are people happier? Why is their well-being better off in developed countries, particularly if they are using oil? Well, just think about our country. What is oil used for? Well, one of the most obvious things is it can be refined to turn into petrol. So you can link the idea that lots of people can use oil for their own personal use to power transport, and then link that to improving their quality of life. But also, energy is used a lot in industry and making things, particularly in Asia Pacific countries like China. So you can link the idea of oil being used in factories. Factories will be providing lots of jobs. Jobs will give money, and then people can use that money to improve their quality of life. You can always flip these questions around and maybe talk about places like Africa that don't use a lot of oil, and explain some of those points as well. But just be careful, you've got to remember these place names and or numbers, otherwise you won't get any more than 1 mark for this question. 3.3, outline one advantage of the trend towards something called agribusiness in the UK. So I've seen a few of these questions, they're 2 markers, but rather than having 2 points or 3 points, you've just got to have one and develop it using phrases like which means that. Now, I guess to define what an agribusiness is, it's just when large companies will basically buy out lots and lots of small farms to create one absolutely massive one. So your first mark could simply be large farms that have taken over small ones, which means that they can use their machinery across a large area and therefore get, and this is the key term, get more profit. You could say, potentially, then the food is also cheaper for the consumer or the person that buys the food. A couple of reasons why that is. You could say this is because we don't have to buy food in from abroad, and this is called importing food. So if we are making it in our country, then it should be cheaper because we don't have to pay for the transportation of the food. Or there is something called vertical integration. Now, this is basically when a big company, such as Sainsbury's, they do this quite a lot. They basically do every single step of what's called the supply chain. So they put the seeds in the ground, they then grow the crops. This can be the same for animals as well. They will then harvest them, they will then transport them, they will then package them, and then sell them. So every single step along the journey, they basically control. Now, if you get to a stage where you have all control over every part, that is vertical integration. And because you have such control, you can make basically each stage as cheap as possible to, again, maximize profits for you, make sure you get a lot of money, and then as a result, you are often able to sell the food at a cheaper rate for consumers. 3.4, using figure 10 and your own understanding, discuss the issues arising from the UK's changing energy mix. Right, so I've got to use the figure, so I'm sure it's going to have specific names or numbers that we can put in. We've got to discuss the issues arising from the UK's changing energy mix. This is just basically where we get our energy from. Issues, we often think of the negatives, don't we? But as with most 6 markers, to get the top marks, you've got to balance your points of view. So we've got to talk about the negatives, but also what about the opportunities? What about the good things as well? So we'll look at the figure. We've got lots of bar charts. The light grey is what we used in 2006, and the dark grey, what we used in 2016. So in terms of the percentages here, we've got to use some of these and reference the types of fuel in our answer. Without those, you're really going to struggle to get more than 2 marks. So we look at the pattern. We can see that in 2006, we use a lot of coal and gas. Now, there's loads of key terms you can throw down here to say that these are fossil fuels. They are from under the ground. Once they're burned, they give off harmful greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, which will enhance the greenhouse effect and lead to global warming. So, certainly for coal, we are using a lot less. Now, again, you can say that's great based on all the ideas with global warming. However, the negative with that, think about where all the coal mines are in the UK, and a lot of them are in sort of the north of England, which, as we know, is traditionally quite poor anyway, certainly compared to the south. So you can say there's a loss of employment there, loads and loads of mines, coal mines have now gone, so people have lost jobs. So we need to talk about some of those negatives. In terms of the gas, actually, interestingly, it looks like we have used more in 2016. Now, what might have contributed to this is fracking. Fracking that has been used in America for a number of years has now come to the UK. Fracking is where you force water and sand and chemicals under high pressure down into the ground and cracks shale rock to get natural gas out of it. And that might have be able to explain why we are using more. The good things with that, obviously, we have lots of gas, shale gas in our own country, which means we don't have to import energy from Russia, if we're talking about natural gas or oil from the Middle East potentially. So it gives us what's called energy security, which is good, which means we don't have to rely on other parts of the world. In terms of things like nuclear, looks like we're using a bit more in 2016, which again you can argue is good because compared to coal and gas, it doesn't give off anywhere near the same amount of emissions. However, nuclear waste can still be very radioactive once energy has been created. So it has to be gotten rid of and disposed very, very carefully. Otherwise, radiation could start impacting on wildlife and the health of humans. We could also say that if we are using more nuclear energy, there's going to be more power plants, potentially a greater risk of accidents, such as Chernobyl in Ukraine. But finally, I guess what is most noticeable in 2016 is we are using more called renewable energy. This is energy potentially we can carry on using because things like the wind and the sun won't run out. So what we've got then is wind and solar onshore. So these are wind turbines and solar panels on land, wind turbines offshore or out to sea, and bioenergy. Bioenergy is basically burning living things rather than coal and oil, which are fossils. So it'd be things like very starchy plants or vegetable oil. You can burn that and get energy. The positive with that, again, linked to the idea that there's very, very little emissions given off. I say little rather than none, because to transport maybe something like a wind turbine from where it's made to where it is produced, it might obviously, well, it will have to be transported. So there will be a tiny bit of emissions, but once it's up and running, very little, if any. However, another negative, particularly with wind turbines, you've got this key term called NIMBYism, which stands for not in my backyard, which means I like the idea of it. However, I don't want a wind turbine next to me because it will spoil my view. It may reduce the price of my house as well. So there's a few of those negatives. But then also, obviously, if we do need more energy for a particular reason, we can always buy in more coal or more oil. But it's very, very difficult / impossible to say we need it to be really, really windy at this point in time, or we need it to be really sunny. So the problem with renewable energies is often they don't produce as much energy as the non-renewables. So you can talk about that being an issue, particularly if we want to use more and more energy for whatever it might be in the future. So as long as you explain the issues, the negatives, some of the opportunities as well, and reference some of the sources of energy and the figures, perfect, you'll be on the 6 marks. Okay, this section, it will say answer either question 4, 5, or 6. Now, there'll be at least one of you that answers the food question in your end of year exam. Don't let it be you. We have never taught you food, not once. So you leave all of question 4 out. As easy as it might be, completely forget about it. Let's focus on then question 5, the water topic. So let's skip past the map for a sec. The question 5.1, name one country with a 91 to 100% access to basic drinking water services. So 1 mark. Is as easy as it gets. All you've got to do is you've got to have a look at the key. You've got to understand and read that the 91 to 100% is the dark blue, and then you've just got to write down the name of a country shaded in that colour. So Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, or Egypt. Easy. Question 5.2, bit harder. How many of the African countries shown in that figure 12 had less than 50% access to basic drinking water services? Shade 1, circle only. So let's have a look at the key. We're looking for less than 50%. So we're looking for the orange. So add them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and almost missed out Equatorial Guinea. So that would be 10. So the answer is C, 10. That gets you 1 point. The second part of this question. What percentage of the 48 countries in Africa for which the data is shown had less than the 50% access to basic drinking water services? Answer to 1 decimal place. So we've worked out that 10 of the countries do. And now they've just told us, which saves us the trouble of counting them all, that there are 48 countries in Africa. So what I would do 10 divided by 48 equals, and then we are after a percentage, so times by 100, and you should get to 1 decimal place 20.8%. 5.3, describe the distribution of countries which have a 76 to 90% access to basic drinking water services as shown in figure 12. So all we're doing here for 2 marks, describe what's called the distribution. Basically, where are the countries? Now we can either have 1 point that we develop or 2 separate points for 2 marks. So let's have a look again at the figure. We're looking this time for the lighter, the brighter blue. Where are they then? So a few different answers. But remember, something that will always remind you of this in an exam is the compass point. So ideally, maybe we can use that when answering this question. So you could say a lot of them are in the south of Africa. Or rather than saying a lot, to be even more specific, count them. So 1, 2, 3 countries are located in the south of Africa. You might realise that most of them are on the coast, apart from Botswana that's landlocked. So that can get you the mark. You could say that 4 out of the 8, so 1, 2, 3, 4, are located on the west, in the west of Africa. So any of those marks, any of those points to reference it, should get you 2 marks. 5.4, outline one reason why some countries have a limited availability of water. So loads of possible answers here. We've just got to give one reason and develop that point. So, for instance, you could talk about what's called the physical reasons for limited water. So things like the weather and climate. And so some countries are located in dry areas. Maybe if you want, you could throw in an example at this point, such as near the Sahara Desert in Africa, or as we know, anywhere around the tropic lines. That is where air sinks or descends, where you get high pressure, which is area will often be very, very dry or arid. So to develop that point, obviously, looking at the mark scheme, all you simply have to put is this means that there is limited or low rainfall, and that'll be plenty. But if you can't think of that one or don't want to put that one, you could say, well, a lot of the time, countries that have limited water are the poor ones. Therefore, they can't store water because they can't afford to build things like a dam or a reservoir. So no water can be stored if it gets really, really dry. But you could also say, well, maybe the rock in some of these countries or the geology is very porous or permeable, which basically means when it rains, the water doesn't stay on the surface, it sort of filters down into the rock below the ground. This is the case for many countries in Africa, where a lot of the water is trapped in the groundwater or in what's called aquifers, and they just can't get it out the ground because they don't have the money or the expertise to do so. So any of those reasons, just develop one of them, and that'll be your 2 marks. 5.5, explain how different strategies can be used to make water supplies more sustainable. So 6 marker, but probably the easiest 6 marker of the whole paper, because all you've got to do is state and explain different methods. No need for any analysis or evaluation here. Just got to make sure that your explanations linked to sustainable or sustainability. Basically, make it really clear to the examiner the reason you're explaining, the strategy you're explaining is also going to last a long time into the future. So, loads of different ones to explain. We could talk about governments introducing laws such as hosepipe bans, and then you can link that to the idea of conserving water for the future. You could talk about building huge reservoirs so water can be stored in case it is dry. You can talk about water efficient farming methods such as drip irrigation, which instead of spraying fields with lots of water, water is slowly dripped basically straight onto the bottom or the base of plants to avoid loads of water being wasted, sprayed where it doesn't need to be, or evaporated off. Could talk about maybe plants again and say that we can plant drought resistant crops. So these are plants that don't need much water to thrive. You could talk about maybe things in the home or what's called domestic use, such as reducing the number of showers that you have, only using washing machines and dishwashers when they are full. So it's all this idea of conservation. Using grey water, which is water that's already been used once from baths, sinks, washing machines, etc., and how that water can be used on other things, such as watering your plants. Could talk about maybe the desalination plants that extract salt from seawater to turn that into fresh water. You could use all of those. We've also got a case study as well. And for this section, you've only got 2 case studies to remember. It's either the really big water transfer in China, but we don't need that here. The better one to use would be the project that is funded by the charity WaterAid in the UK in a part of Ethiopia called Hitosa. All they basically did in the 1990s is they put in lots of pipes that got water from the mountains, and gravity was used rather than any other form of energy, and water trickled down these pipes to an area where a lot of people used to get water from streams that often used to dry up or are a bit dirty. But the water now comes from the mountain, they get more of it, and they can use that for the future. Good thing about that example is the people that use it can easily maintain it. They don't need a lot of training. It's very, very cheap to run and to set up, and will last a long time. So this is an idea of maybe intermediate technology. It might be a keyword from the previous topic that you can include here to say, well, yes, there are better ideas, but this was a really good one. It brings the community together. They all know how to use it. So any of these particular examples that I've mentioned, you can explain. Make sure you link to the future, and then hopefully you'll get 5 or 6 out of 6.